Online. And we have another show for you here from Canada, live on Facebook and also, of course, on the Radio Canada International website. And we'll be shown in studio after we take this cross-country tour of this lovely country with its lakes and rivers and mountains. And there's the flag. How about that? Waving in the breeze. Canadian, one of the most recognized flags in the world, by the way. After the British flag, the United States flag, Japan, that kind of thing.
But the great thing about Canadians is they don't make a big thing of waving the flag.
No, they don't. But it's there, and it's recognized as a, easily recognized symbol. Anyway, this is the program. Here we are with my friends Terry Haig.
Hey.
And Levon Savants.
Hello.
This one is Levon here. This guy.
That's Levon. Okay.
Because they were showing a picture of Terry. I'd just like to say hello to our listeners on World Radio Paris and also the shortwave service from Germany and Kauri 97.5 in Nigeria. And we have a show once again talking about the news and views from Canada, Canadian innovations, Canadian viewpoints on world affairs, and just some occasionally generally interesting stuff from Canada and about Canada. And today on the program, Terry, what do you have for us?
I've got a story, an interview with a lady who did a big study on the Great Lakes and plastics seeping their way into the Great Lakes and seeping their way into the ecological system, which means they seep into us when the fish eat them. Not a good picture.
All right.
But there's hope.
Well, that's good. Levon?
I'll have an interview with a former national security advisor to two prime ministers about the foreign policy challenges facing Canada and other Western countries.
Okay. Now, I have another environmental report to go something along the lines of yours, but this one is about carbon emissions, and it's a UN report and says we're not really doing nearly as well as we're supposed to be doing. So that's coming up a little bit later on The Link Online. All right, Levon, we're going to start out with you, and you are back from a trip to Ottawa where there were some big names in the international scene. What was going on there?
Well, there was this big summit on Canadian foreign policy. There was dozens of academics, former diplomats, soldiers, humanitarian workers, members of the Canadian civil society, and guests from outside of Canada for this summit called Summit on Canada's Global Leadership. And it featured some of these bigger thinkers and practitioners of foreign policy in Canada, international development, people who are on the cutting edge of fighting climate change, and also thinking about Canada's overall security policy. And one of the people who was there was Richard Fadden, and he's one of the most distinguished civil servants in Canada, recently retired. He served two prime ministers, Prime Minister Stephen Harper and then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as their national security advisor. He's also the former head of Canada's internal intelligence service, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, and he's a former deputy minister of defense. So that's just some of the things he has done in government, in the Canadian government over the last 40 years. And I sat down with him to talk about his vision of the challenges facing Canada and other Western countries in articulating a foreign and a security policy in this very rapidly changing world. And Mr. Fadden has written and spoken about this, and he talks about meta issues facing Canada and other Western democracies. So I began by asking him what he means by these meta issues.
Meta issues, to start off with, are issues that affect other issues, just so that we understand one another. And I think there are four significant ones. The first one is the rise of revisionist states. By revisionist, I mean states that are very unhappy about their status in the world, and they want to change these. The two main ones are Russia and China. They really aren't happy. They're prepared to use virtually any means short of war to get their goals. And I think that virtually any other policy by any other country today has to deal with the fact that these two countries have a different perspective, and we have to find a way of dealing with it. The second one is what I call a dysfunctional West. I don't think the West generally is as coordinated as it could be. We don't have a common understanding of what kind of threat China and Russia present to the West. We tend to deal with them bilaterally, except when there's a sort of a major issue like trade or something of that nature. So I think Russia and China are taking advantage of the fact that the West isn't talking with a single voice, by which I don't mean that one country should be able to articulate a broad policy and we all have to follow it. But I don't think NATO, for example, is doing as well as it could be to bring together the various Western countries. The third meta issue was what I call radicalization to violence. By that I mean old-fashioned terrorism, but also right-wing extremist violence. And I made a point of including this because I don't think it's gone away. It's true that we haven't had any major 9/11 kind of event in North America. There have been a lot of significant events in Europe over the years, and in the developing parts of the world, terrorism and insurgency is a day-to-day problem, and you can't ignore it. It's something that governments can't ignore because the objective of terrorism is to terrorize, and when populations are terrorized, governments have to do something, and it diverts resources and attention. And the third one, or the fourth one rather, was all things cyber. I think you can range from cyber war to cyber propaganda, cyber crime, and cyber espionage. I don't think we've got our heads around this yet. So that in dealing with all sorts of issues, let me just take nuclear proliferation as a substantive issue. Cyber propaganda on the part of other countries about what this is and is not is a significant issue. It affects the kind of policy conversations we can have and the kind of negotiations we have. So, somebody might have added climate change because I think it's a pretty significant issue. My thinking about these four meta issues was short to medium term, and I don't think climate change has quite reached that level yet. But I would be willing to argue that in a few years it will.
And that was an excerpt of my interview with Richard Fadden. He's former national security advisor to Prime Ministers Harper and Trudeau. And I spoke to him on the sidelines of this summit on Canada's global leadership in Ottawa earlier this week.
It's interesting that when he talks about climate change, I remember interviewing Gwynne Dyer, whom you know, who's a well-known geopolitical analyst. And it must be at least 10 years ago, if not longer, that he wrote a book called Climate Wars, in which he said that he had spoken to military leaders around the world, and they were already planning for conflicts caused by climate issues. And it's a pretty serious book. And a few years after that, I interviewed him again, and I said, well, what's changed? He says, nothing. Everything is as I had been saying in the book, several years earlier. It's nothing's changed. We're still heading down this path. And it has very serious implications.
It was one of the issues that was really discussed. And what was interesting that this conference brought together not just, your usual suspects in the academia and hardcore national security people, but also a lot of people from the NGOs that work on climate change. And this is what they were telling, Canada's development policy, the only time it was mentioned during this recent election that we had was when Conservative leader Andrew Scheer promised to cut it by third. And people were saying, and you had people on all sides of the political spectrum saying that this is a foolish idea, that, Canadians must understand that it's not just a good and moral thing to spend this money on development and helping poorer countries deal with climate change. It's just basically selfish thing for Canada to do, because this will prevent or mitigate huge inflows of migration and wars. And one of the people I spoke with, Stephen Cornish from the David Suzuki Foundation, who is a former president of Doctors Without Borders, he was talking about this new wave of migrants we're seeing from South America, especially in the United States. They're dealing with that. And he says, initially, people talk about them fleeing violence, but he says if you dig deeper, you realize that first of all, these people moved from their villages because climate change affected their subsistence farming. So they moved from the villages into the cities, where they then face other challenges that forced them to seek some kind of better life in the United States and maybe eventually in Canada as well. So he says, you have to understand that the underlying issue, and it's already happening, that we have millions of people on the move because of climate change and the possibility of conflict it's going to create.
Well, when you have people pushing into an area that's already occupied, of course you're going to have some kind of a conflict, which, I mean, basically you're seeing that now. I think even back then, Gwynne Dyer said India has built a fence between them and Bangladesh because they don't want Bangladeshis flooding into the country when the sea level rises and pushes millions of Bangladeshis out of where they are now. So that's a potential there.
And we got just a glimpse of something like that happening, earlier in Canada, where we had 40, maybe up to 40,000 people crossing the border, and irregularly. I mean, maybe these migrants are not climate-related migrants, but it gives you a glimpse of what might happen. There were a lot of people talking at the conference. One of them was Roland Paris, who's also another former national security and foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau, and was saying Canadians have to stop thinking of themselves as this isolated, we have three oceans around us and the United States on the south, and we're kind of buffered from all these world conflicts. It's no longer the case. It's not a fireproof house. We're actually on the top of this condominium, and the downstairs floors are already burning. So it was very, very interesting. There's a lot of interesting discussions.
Did they get into 5G at all? Because that's a big discussion in terms of security as well.
Yes, one of the things that I discussed with Dr. Richard Fadden was China's influence in 5G and how this will affect Canada's foreign policy, security policy, and Canada's intelligence sharing with other countries. So why I was in Ottawa was we are creating this podcast series that we're hoping at some point in the future will air. But so we'll feature many interviews from the tape that I collected in Ottawa.
Okay, so that's coming up sometime in the future. We're not exactly sure, but you're working on that now, right?
Yes.
All right, good podcast series coming up. Terry,
So your work's all done for the next 3 months, right?
if only.
You're cagey savants.
Terry, we're coming up to you in
What
just
an
a moment.
inspiration.
Well, this is a story that we have touched upon in the past, and it is something that is not really making big news, but we have heard about plastic pollution in the ocean, but it's happening elsewhere, right, Terry?
Big time in the Great Lakes, which is what, 20% of the world's fresh water?
Oh, it's huge, yes.
It's something like that.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge.
I mean, it's amazing. You can see them. You can see the Great Lakes from outer space.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I've seen them many times from outer. Okay. Now, a lady named Gail Kratzberg. She's a professor of engineering and public policy at McMaster University. Okay, in Hamilton, hard by Lake Ontario, did a study of what's going on in the Great Lakes as far as the microplastics and this and that and the other things happening, and it's really awful. She's saying it's just about being as bad. It's just about as bad as what we're seeing in the oceans now, and God knows we've seen tons and tons of pictures of that, right? So I spoke to her on which is hence why I'm here, right? And to pass that along. So I spoke to her on Thursday, and I began by asking her how the plastics actually get into the Great Lakes.
Several ways. First of all, on textiles, on fabrics, to make them waterproof, rigorous for outdoor use, and so on. When you put them in your washing machine, microplastics wash off of them, and they go into the sewage system, and most sewage treatment plants can't capture them, so it goes into the lake. So that's one way, just from textiles. And it's hard for us to try and figure out how we can stop that, but a really severe way, which is so easy to stop, is our habit of using single-use plastics and putting them, thinking that we're doing a good thing. You know, you get a plastic bag from the grocery store, you put your onions in it, you take it home, you put your onions away, and then you throw your plastic bag in the blue bin. Unfortunately, our blue bins are not being done correctly. People are contaminating our blue bins. Things are going in that shouldn't be there. There's food waste in there. And the majority of what goes in the blue bin ends up in a landfill. Now think about that plastic bag. It's very light. It's very airy. You get a little bit of wind, and it blows away. And it blows away, and it goes eventually back into the lakes. And once they're in the lakes, they can choke things, but they can also be broken down by bacteria into microplastics again that look like food particles for little fish, for example, and they start to eat them.
But, okay, so you're saying that we need swift action. What is swift action to you? What does that mean?
First of all, we are seeing some enlightened organizations, enlightened businesses saying we're not going to use plastics in our facility anymore. If you want a bag, you're going to pay for it. You will use paper bags, and people will buy those. You will use cloth bags, and people will buy those. Nothing is free. But they're easy steps, Terry. They're really easy things. Today, when somebody listening to your show decides to go out shopping and needs 3 apples, put the 3 apples in your shopping cart. Mm-hmm. Forget about the plastic bag. It's not going to get recycled, chances are, and you don't need it. Why are people putting bananas in plastic bags? They're already attached to each other. They already come wrapped. Yep. You don't need plastic bags. Just think. It's just about, we're so used to it. We're so accustomed to it. We think it's all fine because it all gets recycled. But the truth is, it's not getting recycled. It's getting into the lakes. It's killing fish. It's getting into our drinking water. And we have a choice just to think twice before we take that plastic bag.
For you, the lakes are more than just about environment. It seems to be, when I'm doing the research on you, it's spiritual for you as well.
It is. The lakes are a extraordinary place. They're the largest single body of fresh water on the planet. They can be seen from outer space. Surely we who live around it must cherish them and protect them. They're a global wonder, and that we take them for granted and use them as a garbage pail is astonishing, and it's simply not acceptable. They're a magnificent jewel on the planet, and we should be proud of being here and want to steward their well-being.
That was part of my interview with Gail Kranzberg, an engineering and public policy professor at the Booth School of Engineering at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. She carried out a study about the growing plastics pollution in the Great Lakes. The whole report is online. It's in the story, and it's also published in the Journal of Waste Resources and Recycling, which I'm on the cover of this week, as a matter of fact. That's where it is. If you want to see it, it is online, and it's being published this week in the Journal of Waste Resources and Recycling.
Yeah, the plastic is the fact that the fish and the birds and so on are eating this stuff.
Yeah, because they think it's food.
They think it's food, and it ends up clogging up their stomachs, and they think they're full, and so they don't eat, and so they starve to death, or it simply blocks their gastrointestinal tract.
But don't we eat them too, Mark? I mean, we catch those fish and then we wind up eating them.
Well, we don't eat the stomachs, but,
we end up consuming the microplastics that are in the water. But there is still no definitive research on what the microplastics do to us. So
well, they think, here's the thing, how it could affect the food is that the microplastics are in the water, and they absorb toxic materials that are in the water as well, like heavy metals and stuff. And so when creatures eat that, the toxic chemicals or metals or whatever leach out into the system. So the plastic's still there, untouched pretty much, but the toxins in there end up in us. And as you pointed out, we get this now because it's in the water. If you go to the drinking fountain and have a drink, there's microplastics in there because they're so tiny, they're not filtered out by the various filtering systems.
Plastic bottles?
Plastic bottles. I mean,
They call them micros.
anyway.
But it's bad news, man. Right?
Yeah, but she's right. When you think about it, we use plastic all the time. We shouldn't. Why would you have plastic bottles? Why do we need so many plastic bags and so on?
But I'm just doing a story as we speak about Vancouver has now come out and banned them. It's going to be phased in, as well as straws.
Yeah.
I mean, single-use plastics are a serious threat, but it's pretty easy if everybody just doesn't use them. We could make a dent in this fight, right?
Well, we can try anyway, but there are so many millions out there and so many still being used that
Right.
it's a tough battle. It's got to people.
But it's
have
up to us too, though.
change our attitude and say, look, I don't need that plastic straw, for example.
Well, that's what she's saying. Just use your
it's
head.
very, very interesting. I remember how, for example, when I was growing up in Armenia, we would go shopping at the farmer's market, and you would bring these hand-woven baskets, and you would lay, potatoes at the bottom, and it's like the way you kind of structured your shopping. Okay, I buy the potatoes first, and then other things that are harder, and then you go to things that are soft, and so you end up with the greens at the very top, and it's not a single piece of plastic. You bring this back home, and it, part of it goes into the fridge, part of it is cooked right away. And I'm thinking, why are we still not, why are we not doing it here?
Because we're lazy. It's convenient. And in Europe, for example, the same thing. People would do their
That's what I was
grocery
gonna
shopping with net bags.
Yeah.
They carry it in their purse or their pocket. It's a little net bag, and you unfold it and put the stuff in, and
Is it happening still in Europe? So in Armenia now, are people still using the old systems or the old system?
And unfortunately, less and less. And then people, it's the same thing. This convenience and of the plastic bags, and it's everywhere.
And the trouble is that we go to the effort of recycling this because we're all concerned. We put it in the recycling bin, but only 9% of that
Gets recycled.
gets recycled. So 91% of that stuff ends up somewhere in the environment, and usually in the wrong place. So, and I've got an environmental story coming up too.
Go for it.
So we're going to come with that in just a second. Okay, well, we've been talking about the environment and environmental reports, and the United Nations has come out this week with a couple of reports, and these are to do with the gap between where we are supposed to be in terms of reducing our carbon emissions and where we actually are, and what that might lead to, because it seems to be leading to about a 3.2 degree Celsius increase in global average temperature by the end of the century. Now, we say, 3.2 degrees, what's that? That's not much. But in terms of the environment, in fact, it's really huge. And I spoke to Robert McClellan about the reports, and he's a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And he said we would really need to cut our carbon emissions in half within the next decade, which is a big challenge, and near zero by mid-century, which is obviously, again, a huge challenge. And that's just if we want to keep the global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is sort of the target
Paris
they're after.
Accords, yeah.
But right now, we're already hovering at around or just above 1 degree Celsius change, and we've already seen what that's doing in terms of the climate and the weather patterns and so on and so forth. So in this excerpt of our conversation, he said a 3 degrees rise would result in the kind of world where we didn't want to raise our children. So in this excerpt, I asked him to explain that, what he meant by that.
Well, it's a kind of planet where 3 degrees warming leads to sea level rise that will displace hundreds of millions of people. On the North American Great Plains, droughts become 200 to 300% more common. Flood return rates increase by 75 to 100%, where food systems start to groan under the weight of trying to produce enough food, with water and extreme heat being challenges for farmers. So there's a lot of impacts that will be very disruptive and where we will have passed a tipping point where it's difficult to get back to the system that we used to have.
But I thought we were aiming for a maximum of like 1.5 degrees, and now they're talking about 3.2. What's going on?
Well, essentially, it's the lack of what's going on that's the problem, is that nobody's doing what needs to be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, they continue to grow in most countries. We are locking ourselves into 3 degrees or warmer by the end of the century. I would rather be in our situation where we're reading the warnings and we're given time to act than people in the Bahamas, who you do not need to explain to them the risks of climate change and that action needs to be taken. And that's very common, we find, is that in research, is that people who have lived through natural disasters are much more ready to recognize that climate change is a real risk that we need to do something about. So you're correct in the sense that people may say, oh, not another climate change report. But the reality is that things are not improving, and we do need these reminders that action is needed. And if people get tired of hearing them, then perhaps the best way to deal with it is to take action.
What do you say to people, though, who will look at the statistics and say, yeah, but the world's shipping fleet, for example, emits more pollution than all of Canada, or other things that say, why have a carbon tax when if people just inflated their car tires properly and changed the air filters much more often, then we'd have no problem at all?
Well, I mean, there's lots of ways that you can look at this and say, well, if somebody else did something differently, or why doesn't China cut its emissions? That's more important than Canada's, and things like that. We can keep, splitting up the problem until nobody's responsible, and then everybody suffers.
Now, the idea of a carbon tax is getting a lot of resistance in Canada, and right now it's extremely low. And there was a report out just today saying for a carbon tax to be effective, it's got to be up to like $210 per ton. That would have massive effects on the economy, and wouldn't people really resist that if they're already resisting a $15 per ton carbon tax here in Canada?
If you look at the results of the last federal election in Canada, you'll see that the majority of Canadians actually voted for parties that are in favor of strong action on climate change and that support a climate tax. I think one of the things that you also see is that you're right, if the carbon tax is so low that it has no meaningful effect, people do see it as a bit of a tax grab and say, well, what's the point of implementing this if it's not really going to make much of a difference? And I think that's really what people are looking for, is to see carbon reducing policies and climate policies more generally that achieve something. I think that's what people are looking for.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Robert McClellan. He is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And as with all our reports, if you want to find out a lot more, you can go to our website. The full stories are there, along with a whole bunch of other interesting stories as well. So once again, you have this situation where you've got a body saying, look, you got to act. And politicians are going, yeah, we're working on it, You're speechless.
Well, listen, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, in Ottawa, again, they were talking about this, that we have 10 years. That's to reduce our emissions. And drastically. And that, and how do you do that in a country like Canada, where so much of our national wealth comes from the energy sector in Western Canada, and where a lot of people feel so alienated because, this fighting climate change would mean that we stop exporting oil and natural gas.
It means a drastic change in lifestyle for a lot of people and how we do things. And, in terms of how we build houses, for example, how we heat houses, how we get from point A to B, for example. Now, one of the things I talked about with him, which is not in the interview, was, why don't we have high-speed rail in Canada? This is a huge country. We have tiny countries like, Japan and Europe, which have high-speed rail. Why not in this huge country? Get people out of their vehicles, get people out of aircraft. You'd create benefits to the economy because you'd have all these people working. And he said, yeah, but politicians talk about this, but they do nothing. So anyway, if you have thoughts on this, drop us a line here at RCI, the link. And now for my colleagues Lavon Savunts, Terry Haig, and in the control room, Léo Boulanger, Benoit Durand, and El Capitan, Pierre Dutil.
Who?
Pierre Dutil. That's all the time we have for the show for today. Hope you enjoyed the show. And as always, look at the website, download the app. We've sort of changed our page a little bit, the home page. So it's no longer here, it's down here kind of thing. But it's there if you want to download the app, and you'll be able to get all our shows and stories and reports and blogs and so on and so forth.
On these things.
On those things, yeah. Oh,
Portable.
Portable.
You
All
can
right.
read them anywhere.
Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.